What's going on? This is Louis Angel right here with AE Mind. And check this out. I have a few special guests with us here today. We have the World Memory Champ, two-time now World Memory Champ, and medical student extraordinaire, Miss Cathy, Mullen, and Alex Mullen. What's going on, guys? How are you guys doing today?
Doing
Hey,
good.
Louis.
Yeah, hey Lewis, thanks for having us.
Okay. Yeah, thank you guys for getting on. For those of you guys that saw the previous interview, I interviewed Alex, and we focused mainly on the memory side, the memory sports side of his special, what he specializes in. We briefly talked about what he's doing as a student. So for this interview, we're actually going to focus and dive more into that aspect of his world, which is how to take the memory techniques that he uses to become and break world records and become champions, and also Cathy uses as they go on and teach students how to improve their memories. We're going to focus more in that aspect of their world. So again, thank you guys for joining me, and we're about to dive right into this.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
So, I mean, you guys are now both in this world, right? I don't know, Cathy, did Alex kind of just drag you into this world of memory? Or was it something that you also were like, oh, this is interesting, I want to learn it on my own?
Well, I think from the start, I didn't really have a choice. Alex talks about it all the time, but I was definitely interested in seeing, we're both in med school and we were both in college and studying really hard. So even as he was starting out, I think we were both kind of interested in seeing how we could use these techniques to improve our studying experience.
Right. And Alex, so when you got into it, I know that you were reading a book by Joshua Foer, Moonwalking with Einstein.
Mm-hmm.
Was that like their first introduction to this world of memory improvement and memory sports?
Yeah, pretty much. So when I was a junior in college, I cracked open that book, and that was really what got me into it. Never heard of memory techniques before that. And, initially was interested by, the fact that I could apply the techniques to school, hopefully to remember, material for exams and things like that better. And after a little bit of time, kind of forgot about that and went and focused on memory sports and competing and trying to, memorize cards and numbers and other useless things like that. And then eventually I kind of, turned back and said, okay, I'm gonna figure out how to really apply these techniques to my school. So hopefully I can, actually use them in an effective way, because I had kind of struggled to use them at the beginning. And, that was something where Cathy and I kind of worked together on that. So, once I kind of came back and at the beginning of medical school started to apply these techniques again, we sort of worked on it together and said, what can we do to make it work? Which pieces of the techniques aren't working, which ones are, and we kind of experimented and found a method that we both used. Obviously everybody uses memory techniques slightly differently, but the method we use now is pretty similar, based on kind of sharing things between each other.
Right, and that's a great thing to have, because we have many friends in this world, memory sports, and some just focus solely on competing and going to these memory competitions and just training for that. And then we have friends that focus on the education side of this, how to really apply this to real world experiences, and in particular education. So
Right.
that's good that you went out there and you mastered essentially both worlds, and then now you guys can partner up and really share those ideas and be like, okay, how can we really apply this to learning things faster? Because at the end of the day, I think, and that's what got me into this sport. It wasn't because I wanted to go out and memorize a deck of cards in a matter of minutes. For you, it's seconds. But it was because I wanted to do better in school. I was struggling in school. So for me, that was my mindset going into this. And then also, like you, I got kind of distracted a little bit because once I fell in love with the sport, I was like, I want to like really get better at it. And then now I'm like coming back to focusing on learning material. So for you, Cathy, seeing Alex go through this journey and seeing him be super committed to improving his scores in the memory sport world, what kind of motivation was that for you as a student and now as a medical student as well?
You mean
Like
seeing Alex's improvement and his successes in the memory sports?
Right.
How's that been?
Yeah.
Well, I think just on a basic level, in life, because I see Alex train every day, I think it's been very motivational, not just from an academic standpoint, but from how I would like to live my life standpoint. Alex is very dedicated, and he's very self-disciplined, which I think is very useful in learning. So that's definitely helped me try to be more, conscious about how I choose to work and very disciplined. Yeah. Not as good as Alex about it, but I try.
And actually, before we even dive into how to, give students the tips and tricks and everything else to help them out in school, let's go into your guys' story because you guys are married now. You guys are, taking over this world right now and memory and education, but you guys actually met at a very young age in school, in preschool, right? Was that like your first introduction to each other where you guys first met?
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, we did meet in preschool.
We went to Willie Price daycare.
That's right. In Oxford, Mississippi. Super random.
But yeah, so we met in preschool, but we don't really remember each other from then.
He was not the memory champ back then. So.
Yeah, more of just like an annoying brat. There's this one memory that we have or not a memory. We actually have a home video of this to prove it. We don't remember it at all. But Cathy's doing some kind of presentation,
like
show and tell type thing, demonstrating some Taiwanese dances.
It's really just me,
really just Cathy's dances to Taiwanese music. And you can see that video, and then you can see me sort of sitting off to the side, and it's pretty clear that I'm losing interest fast, and my head's starting to droop, and I'm getting pretty bored.
And then he fell in love, and then we were married.
Yeah, and then right, and then so maybe like I don't know, 10 years later, we kind of got to know each other better in high school, and it was sort of towards the end of high school that we started dating, and eventually got married. This past year, yeah.
So wait, did you guys go to the same elementary school as well after preschool? Or did
Alex went to a private school in our town, but our town is very small, so we interacted a lot, even though we didn't go to the same school. We did karate together.
You're right. And so eventually we were both on the swim team, which was our probably biggest extracurricular for both of us, and so that was obviously a time that we got to spend a lot of time together.
And we did a lot of projects together, like this Mullen Memory project really isn't our first one. We did all sorts of weird things.
Prior to Mullen Memory, we did all other manner of nerdy projects, such as the science fair. So we would work like our, sophomore and I guess senior year. We didn't do anything junior. We did like a group science fair project together. So we've been kind of doing a lot of stuff.
We did like a piano competition once. Do you remember that?
Right, like a duet piano thing.
We did, yeah. So doing projects together is kind of our thing.
It's been your life story.
I guess so, yeah.
And so then it's not just high school sweethearts. You guys are pretty much just all around young couple that stuck together and are now, you have your own project, which is a Mullen Memory. So now, prior to getting the idea to start that up, Mullen Memory, so you guys are in university, right? Fast forward several years, you guys are in university. Did both of you go to John Hopkins?
No, I went to Princeton.
Yeah.
Alex went to Hopkins.
So we went to different schools. Luckily, they're like sort of close, like maybe a 2-hour, 3-hour train ride. So we were able to kind of visit each other on weekends and things like that. But we did go to separate colleges, and then for med school, we finally got back together again.
Yeah.
At the University of Mississippi,
which is where we're from.
That's where we are right now in Jackson, Mississippi.
Okay, so then you guys are now there. So did the idea of Mullen Memory come about when you guys were in med school already, or were you guys already thinking about that beforehand?
I think it got started in med school. Yeah. So like I said, I had been kind of playing around with the techniques for a while, going back to my junior year of college. But I didn't really kind of apply myself in earnest to using the techniques for my studies and for school until we were getting ready to go to med school. So after we'd kind of graduated already. And I think part of that is because we were both engineering majors in college, and it's certainly true that memory techniques are obviously a little more useful for things that are more suitable, that are more memorization heavy, of which engineering is not as much. So when we got back to med school, we said, okay, let's really apply ourselves and get this stuff together.
Well, I did try it in junior year one.
Yeah, Cathy actually.
So I had a class that was much more, these techniques were much more applicable for, which was biochem. In junior year. So that was kind of, Alex was starting then, and so I tried it, and it was like an epic failure because we just didn't have a real idea of, what to do. And so I was like, Alex said, I'm doing these techniques. I said, let's try it for my class. And I still remember that palace a little bit, but I think at the time it discouraged us a tad because we didn't really have what we have now, which is like a better idea of how it works.
Right. And it's a lot of just trial and error, really, because, when you try, you're trying it out, and even, it works really well when you're memorizing just set pieces of information. Like you said, previously, useless data, memorizing cards, you can get your pictures, and that's pretty easy to just store on a location. But when you get this mass amount of data, and I've looked at some of the courses that you guys have to take as medical students, and man, is it a lot to learn and memorize?
Absolutely.
And just to consume. So, to look at that and ask yourself, how can I really take these techniques and apply it to learning actual information? Even as a memory athlete and a very successful memory athlete, that can really, deter you from really pushing forward in the beginning, right? So, when you were, so now at medical school, what are some of the techniques that you've used, or what are some of the refinements that you've made to learning the information that you're learning in school with the techniques?
Yeah, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so just like a really big one, I think we were better at taking notes on how we do it. So in the beginning, we weren't sure, should I be writing down all these images I take, or should I be not just kind of reviewing it randomly? So now we have a very specific way where we take the information that we want to learn, and then we, as we'll get into later, probably convert them into images. And now we have a very specific way that we record it in our notes, so that later when we come back, it's easier to recapture what we were, visualizing.
Yeah, and my kind of thinking about this is, going back to a little bit of the frustrations that we had starting out. One of the first palaces that I made was for our first biochemistry test, and basically the thing that I ran into, first of all, I made images for pretty much everything on the test, and that turned out to be a huge mistake. And so basically the way we do it now is we really try to, when we learn the material, we really try to think about it, just from a conceptual standpoint as well as we can first, and then really distill it down into the specific things that are hard to remember, or are very important to remember sort of in a listicle type fashion. And then we really just encode those specific things. So that was kind of our first big realization, because basically what I found was that I would come back a few weeks later and then be like, now that I've gotten a little bit better handle on this material and how it works, I'm really not even accessing, let's say 2/3 of the images. That stuff I already know now. It's become pretty much second nature to me. So I felt like my palaces were clogged up with all this information that was sort of intuitive to me at that point. You know what I mean? So yeah, just kind of going back to that idea of really encoding those things that are hard to remember, and that will, maybe still be hard to remember even 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the road.
That's almost not even like a memory palace thing too. I think like if you learn about studying, it's asking yourself to really think through the concepts first and really make sure you understand the material. But the memory palace does help us reinforce that behavior.
Right. So, we even think of that as a way to sort of help, the memory palace as a way of helping out our critical thinking, because it kind of forces you to sit down and say, okay, what in this material makes sense and doesn't really need a memory technique, and what, doesn't really have any intuition behind it and just needs to be memorized. So that can kind of force you to think about those differences. Yeah. And then the other, just to wrap up this one question that I've been going on forever about, the other
no,
big,
this is good, man. This is
the
good.
other big kind of, going back to that initial biochem test, the other thing was that I would come back to the material after like 2 or 3 weeks, and, lots of images would be kind of useless at that point, like I said. And then B, I would have basically forgotten a lot of it just because I hadn't really reviewed the material. So I'd come back and, I'd remember like, 30-40% of the images, and the rest would just be these hazy blobs. And that really was frustrating to me. And the conclusion there was really that even when you're using memory techniques, you still need to review the material properly to make it stick. If you really want it to stick long term, memory palace or not, you're still going to have to review it. And so that was the second big conclusion that we made.
That's amazing, because a lot of people think this when they come to us to learn how to do this. They see us performing these amazing feats very quickly, like, oh, you can memorize, for you specifically, Alex, you can memorize thousands of digits of numbers, and cool. How can I apply that to school? And once I go through that once, that's it. I never have to look at that information again. At least that's I don't know if you've ever gotten that from some of the students that you teach, where like you just kind of they're expecting you to just wave a magic wand and to learn these, learn the memory techniques and just apply that information or apply that to their study once, and that's it. They know that information forever. But that's not necessarily the case. As you just said, you still need to go through the process of reviewing the information. Our brain learns best when we can imagine it. Like we'll go through some examples right now, but it also takes that short information from short-term memory to long-term memory when it sees it several times over and over again, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So now, you gave Cathy, you also gave another great point there about, both of you did. So when you're studying the information and you're going through it, especially let's say the first time through, right? Mm-hmm. You guys are saying not to necessarily apply the techniques right away, because I've had those situations even for myself when I'm like trying to learn something new. I'll try to like figure it out right away with the memory techniques, meaning I'll try to visualize every single little thing that I'm memorizing. But like you said, you tried that and it wasn't as successful as you might have hoped for. So that's another great tip for students out there. It's like, you go through the material, you try to conceptualize it as best as you possibly can, and then you apply the memory techniques. So is there, when you actually get to the specifics, do you guys have some examples right now on how you actually take what you've done in the memory world and apply it to the studies?
Yeah, we have some examples.
Yeah. Do you want to take the first one, or I kind of came up first,
why don't you do that?
Let me do that. So we we pretty much use the techniques when we're studying anything these days. So one easy example of that is when you're learning anatomy. So anatomy is obviously a very memorization heavy discipline, and unfortunately anatomy was one of those courses that we took right at the beginning of med school, and we hadn't really nailed down the techniques too well. So full disclosure, this is an example that I just came up with because we don't have that many great ones from anatomy. But going back to anatomy, if I were to retake it, I definitely would use it. So here's a quick one. So in medicine, and if you're talking about the digestive tract, there's basically three sections that people split it into. One is called the foregut, and then the midgut and the hindgut. So foregut, midgut, hindgut. So foregut sort of starting at your mouth and going down your esophagus, and not to get into too many specifics, but one thing you might want to have to remember is the blood supply and the nervous system innervation for each of those sections. So part of the reason they're split up into those categories is because they each have a unique blood supply and innervation. So let's just go through those real quick. So looking kind of at the room behind us, what would happen in the actual memorization process for us is we would see that information and decide, okay, I want to commit this to memory using memory techniques, and then say in our palace at the time we might be imagining that we're in this particular room. So let's just use that, I guess, as an illustration. So for each foregut, midgut, and hindgut, I would use one locus for each of those pieces. So maybe the first locus that I choose is the ceiling for foregut. So the ceiling would be my foregut locus, and then the blood supply to the foregut is the celiac artery. So part of the reason why I chose the ceiling is because it sounds sort of like celiac. So I can just imagine that because it's the ceiling, I think of celiac artery. And then the innervation is the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. So, for that one, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of vagus nerve is like the welcome to Las Vegas sign, or is it?
Yeah.
Is it Viva Las Vegas or welcome to Las Vegas?
Yeah, I think it's welcome.
The kind of like, the famous sort of diamond looking sign. So I imagine that Vegas sign is hanging from the ceiling. So now, in this ceiling locus, I've got ceiling for celiac artery and the Vegas sign for vagus nerve. So that would be my kind of foregut locus there.
Would you create an image for foregut?
Yeah,
or
so that's a good
would you
question.
just like know that, okay, this, I know that this is for gut, or would it be an actual image?
So that's kind of a subtle thing that we deal with often, whether or not you kind of encode the topic.
Yeah.
And what I might recommend for kind of people starting out is to do that more. To if you have kind of a doubt about it, just go ahead and encode the topic as well. So maybe for foregut, maybe you imagine like a number 4 kind of painted on the ceiling, or something like that. Basically, what we've found is that when you kind of do this process of reviewing a lot, like I mentioned before, you find that your association of the topic to the locations becomes very natural. So, once you've reviewed a few times that this particular room houses the foregut, midgut, hindgut material, it's almost unnecessary to have that encoded.
It feels like that.
And of course, there's no perfect way to do it, but that's the strategy that we've kind of fallen into is, not really encoding that as much.
And both of you have found that this works, right? It's not like, oh, Alex, it works for Alex because he memorizes so often. You as well, right, Cathy? Like this process, if like you just said, it feels like this is the foregut. It feels like this is the midgut area.
Right.
So do you also not have to always encode the actual topic, Cathy?
Yeah, I don't have to. I think when we both started out, one of the things we tried was encoding. But for me, and that's one thing that we like to talk about is Alex is the world memory champion, but I'm just, the world memory champion's wife. Like, so I don't do these techniques competitively, but it definitely works for me. And just the other day, we were in our hometown. And we've, sprinkled these palaces all over our hometown where we grew up. And we were just driving around and we were like, oh my gosh, like it just feels like cardiac stuff here. You kind of have that sense. And one thing we even thought was pretty funny was we've been walking around in these places in our minds so much that it almost feels like we've been there recently,
Yeah. So,
it's such a weird feeling.
I had mentioned before.
It is.
that we recently went to Baltimore, which is where I went to college at Johns Hopkins. And it was weird because I haven't been there in almost 3 years now, but I would go back to some of these places on my home campus and feel like I was just there because I had been using it for
so
various
actively
things, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is weird. 'Cause I memorized the Avengers movie, or like scenes from the Avengers. I use that as a memory palace, and I use that. Where did I use that? At the World Memory Competition for cards. So I was training for that heavily, that route specifically. And then I just saw a poster of the Avengers somewhere, I don't know where, but I saw the poster and then it just triggered, like the entire movie just kind of flashed in my mind. I was like, oh, that's insane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's so true. Like it triggered like memories from the World Memory
It feels
Competition,
like it, yeah.
Exactly. Because we use it like so often and so much, right? So now, okay, so let me backtrack a little bit. So you're creating, let's go into like creating these locations or palaces, because I think that's very critical for everyone really. For us as memory athletes, we have to create a lot when we have to when we train for these competitions, because we can't just use one palace or one location set to memorize 10 decks of cards. We need to create a lot more than that. So it makes sense for us as memory athletes to create more locations. But for students, that's where I think a lot of them get discouraged, because like, do I have to have 1,000 locations or these memory palaces to memorize, say just my body or my anatomical. How do you say it?
Anatomical structures. Yeah.
Anatomical structure. Do I have to have all these palaces? So what would you guys answer to a question like that? Do I really have to spend hours and hours creating these locations, or can I just settle on one set location and then reuse those locations? What would you guys say to that?
So if it's something that we want to commit long term, we generally do not reuse locations. And that's just because, kind of back to the concept we were talking about, we want that place to retain that feeling, those concepts that we wanted to memorize. So we don't overwrite. In response to, do I have to sit down and think of hundreds and thousands of palaces? We usually say it's easier than you think it is, because there's just so many places, right? Like that you've been and and it doesn't even have to be, actually accurate. You just have to be able to think of it and think of the same loci every time.
Yeah. And quickly going back to some of the big quote unquote discoveries that we made about how to use the techniques. One of the big things that we do is we have a sort of a brainstormed list of palaces that we might want to use. So, we've gone back, some time ago and said like, okay, my home in Oxford, my home in Jackson, my, movie theater, libraries, whatever, and just kind of listed those out. But we don't really actually think of the loci within those palaces. So, we don't like for memory sports competitions and things, I know every single locus in every palace, and I built it that way specifically because that's how I want to use it in the competitions. But for a learning purpose, maybe if I'm learning pathology, I'll just pull up that brainstorm list and say, okay, I'm going to use my neighborhood right here for this first, block of pathology. And then I'll start somewhere and I'll just choose the loci in the moment as I'm learning the material based on what I think is worth knowing in that area. So like, maybe I'm talking about, acute inflammation, and there's like, 5 main components of acute inflammation. So I'll use the house across the street and I'll do kind of one thing in each of that rooms of that house. And so we don't like, there's no like, palace building phase where we think of thousands of loci ahead of time. We just do it as we go through the material.
I think that's also useful because it lends kind of a natural flow to it. If I'm just kind of mentally plopping myself down, on our town main street and I'm learning about cardiology, everything kind of flows from there as I'm walking down. It also goes with the way I'm kind of learning it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's also geographically located in my mind.
Yeah.
Got it.
It's helpful.
Okay. So it's not like, yeah.
Sorry, it's helpful. Just one last point. It's helpful for organization a lot, because we can. And this is this is one of the reasons we like to use palaces rather than just images, just links. Is that we can use the palace to our advantage to organize the material. So what I just said about using the foregut, midgut, and hindgut in this room. If we want to, in the future, if we want to encode any kind of information about those things, then we can always come back to this specific room and think, okay, this room has got all the info we want to know about it. And in that way, we can make sure that the material is organized in a nice, tidy way.
So then at that point, will you guys, because Cathy, you said earlier that you don't like reuse locations, but would that be kind of the exception when you want to add on to the material already in that say palace or in that room?
Yeah. We, I wouldn't go back to the same locus per se, but I would find something else in there and add it in, or maybe have it interact with an image I already have existing, but not, overwriting it.
Right, exactly. So like if we were using the ceiling here for foregut and then maybe there was another piece of info we wanted to add, we might come down and just use the window right here as another locus kind of in association with foregut.
And it's actually pretty easy because, it's like you can have multiple memories of things happening in your living room. And it's not like it overrides it, you can still remember it.
So, okay, let me kind of counter that a little bit. From my own experiences, meaning like I reuse these locations for like when I'm learning, certain information. Like I think when I was memorizing the presidents, I reused a specific set of locations, and then I actually applied the periodic table of elements to that same route. So for me, I was able to distinguish the two because I knew, like, I don't know, I could kind of link them together. Like I knew if I saw a washing machine, right, I knew that it wasn't going to be hydrogen for the first element, meaning I wasn't going to confuse the element and the presidents. Have you guys actually like attempted to store multiple sets of different topics on, say, let's say right here, we'll stick with this example, the midgut and all that. Have you guys already attempted to store different things along, say, this specific route, or a route that you guys already used for a different piece of information, and then store something else? And then what was the outcome for that? Did you guys get, say, interference between the stories?
I guess I'll take this one. So this is something that we adopted relatively early on, just based on kind of my personal experience in memory competitions. And I think, I can't remember any specific examples of really experimenting heavily with it, but my sort of initial feeling based on, my competition experience is just that if you want something to kind of stand on its own and really develop a feeling, like I said, of, like this place being the kind of foregut area, my feeling was that I wouldn't want to overwrite palaces. And that's not, it's certainly not to say that, like, like you said, obviously it can still work. We're not saying that it would never work if you overwrite palaces, but our thinking was that, okay, well, if we feel like we aren't going to run out of palaces and we're still going to have enough space, then why not
Yeah.
not overwrite things.
And the other thing, oh, sorry, were you done?
No, go ahead.
I mean, the other two things was people say med school is like drinking out of a fire hydrant, right? It's just like so much stuff all the time. And so it was definitely, I think, probably easier for us to just kind of go fresh, you know? And then the other thing is, because we intend to use this information kind of in real time in the future, it's helpful for us, especially when we're taking tests and hopefully when we're seeing patients, to be able to scan through. And I think that would be easier for us to, you know, say we have a patient with these symptoms, perhaps we can scan through more easily and see what everything that's there without trying to juggle that kind of, you know, double images.
Right.
That makes perfect sense, and that's probably why I'm not in medical school right now, because I would probably just start stacking things on top of each other, and then when I need to like actually retrieve it, I'm like, wait, I have like 10 things on this one location. Which one was which?
Right.
But that's a good tip. Yeah, I did it just because I wanted just for fun to learn these things. So,
Right.
So you know, it wasn't like I was gonna be quizzed on it or whatnot. But cool, you know, good tips there. So
if I could add one more thing,
so we have
real quick, just to wrap it up, just to kind of support what you were saying. One actually thing that I do is, you know, I also use a lot of the same palaces to learn Chinese, and so that was kind of a mistake of mine early on, is that I made these very kind of large locations to learn various Chinese tones and things, and so, because those were so large, I ended up overlapping a lot of the medical stuff I was learning onto those same palaces. And I actually have found that it's usually not too big a problem of those palaces interfering, even though they're in the same place. And I think part of that is kind of going back to what you said, which is just when you're kind of in the, you know, let's say the Chinese mode, the Chinese images just seem to kind of come to you and the medical ones sort of fade away. You know what I mean?
They're different enough.
Right.
And then another one of my theories about that is that for the Chinese ones, you know, a lot of those images are on loci that are, I've just sort of developed a slightly different way of seeing them. So when I saw, say, like this fountain for medicine, I'm using like a particular angle, a particular feeling associated with that fountain. And maybe, you know, I was using a slightly different angle looking at it from the other side for Chinese or something. And so the difference between those two is enough that there's not really much interference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it perfectly does. Yeah, so, okay, it's another thing. I know we're kind of deviating a little bit from what we wanted to get into, but I mean, these are questions that people always ask.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah.
So, well, I have one more along this line of what you just said, which it's perfectly fine to kind of see locations from different angles. Because that was one of my biggest hiccups when I was first starting off, even just like memorizing cards, right? I would memorize a card on a location. Let's say it was the chair, you know, the chair I'm sitting on. And I would say, store it up on top of here. And then when I, you know, finish the 52 cards, I would come back to this one to try to recall it. And I would be looking, say, at the armrest instead of like looking here when I was retrieving it. I was like, I have no clue what I stored on there, right? Did I even store anything on there? But it was just because I was seeing that location from a different angle, right? So I didn't know that, like, when you're recalling, make sure, like, to see it from the same angle that you memorize it in. Have you guys encountered anything like that? Well, you just gave it a perfect example. Or any other examples where you're, like, when you're, like, recalling information, like, does the viewing of the way you see the location, does that affect the recall at all for you?
Well, as a
Like
non-professional competitor in this conversation,
Yeah.
you know, I think Alex does a lot of things where he will put them kind of small, not to scale. Does that make sense? Kind of like what you said, right on top of the chair. So everything I do is more, I guess, more to scale. And so I don't think I really have that problem, but maybe I have and I can't think of it. But, you know, I rarely put things on like a tiny
Like
little
just on an
person,
armrest
just
is
on
what
an
you're saying.
armrest, right?
Right.
Because it's just
Gotcha.
easier for me to kind of, to create it so that it's more something like a memory of mine and not some sort of like weird little thing. But I know Alex does it differently. But for me, as a non-competitive person, that's kind of the trick that I found that helps.
Yeah.
So you use the entire place.
Yeah, if I'm using the desk, I'm not gonna like just
put it at the little corner.
You know, I'm gonna have an elephant like right here at the desk, and so it's a little easier.
Yeah. You know, my experience is actually for medicine is quite similar to Cathy's, I think, where because I'm not using places that I use over and over again, like in memory sports, I usually just tend to pick kind of bigger objects and not really focus on small things. And so things tend to be more to scale, and I have that problem less. But for memory sports specifically, like you just said, that's a huge problem for me. Or not a huge problem anymore, but it used to be.
Yeah.
Because so my conclusion was that basically every time I see a locus, I always see it from the exact same angle. And that's just something that's sort of developed, throughout my experiences. Practice is just I have to see those same loci from the same place, same angle, and that is the case for those.
Got it. Cool. All right. So let's move on. Now that we, covered locations and people at home or listening from wherever they're at, here's the thing. I think the biggest takeaway is be okay with creating these locations, because that's what the top people are doing right now. The Mullen family is doing. They're creating these locations to store the information. So be okay with creating the location, and don't get overwhelmed with the idea that you have to have thousands of locations right from the get-go before you can get started with learning information. You can start just by thinking of your home right now, and then place information along that route, just like what we're about to go into during the next few examples. So I think that eases some concerns there for viewers and listeners at home.
Right.
What you guys just answered. So now I have what you're actually going to cover. You sent me the sheet. So we have the foregut. We covered that. That was on the ceiling. What would be the next thing that you...
Right. Yeah. So I'll try to run through these a little more quickly, hopefully. So, maybe... when I'm thinking of the palace, I never look at pictures or go to the actual palace, right? So in my mind, I just use the first thing that comes to mind. Maybe it's the stairs, down sort of there. I don't know if you can see them right there. So, let's make that the midgut, for instance. So I'm going to go ahead and imagine Lionel Messi standing there on top. Maybe it's kind of a more miniature version of him standing on those steps, holding up one of those same Vegas signs above his head, kind of in a victorious way. And so now I'll explain what those are for. So that's the midgut, and then the blood supply to that is the superior mesenteric artery. And so Messi, Lionel Messi, world famous soccer player, is kind of representing that superior mesenteric, and then he's kind of looking victorious. So that's kind of how I encoded the superior part. And you'll see that's important because the next thing for the hindgut is the inferior mesenteric. So he's holding up kind of victoriously. You got Messi for mesenteric holding up this vagus sign, and that's because the vagus also does the nervous system, the innervation to the midgut. So he's got that vagus sign, superior mesenteric vagus. And then maybe the next place is the kind of couch, or I'll just use over here. Maybe we're doing that painting there. Maybe that's in my memory palace. And in hindgut, it's inferior mesenteric for the artery, and pelvic nerve for the nerve. So, again, I'm going to use some sort of Messi type image for the mesenteric. So maybe now we have Messi on that counter there, and he's just sort of slumped on the ground, feeling like maybe he's injured or something like that in a game, and he's feeling very inferior. So it's inferior mesenteric, and then the innervation is the pelvic nerve. So pelvic, I just think of Elvis. This is the first thing comes to mind. So maybe
pelvic thrust.
So maybe, you got Elvis sort of bending over Messi, seeing what's wrong with him, maybe trying to help. So you just got that, all these images, you can remember the Vegas sign, the ceiling for celiac. You got victorious Messi with the Vegas sign, and you've got Elvis and Messi over here. And that would just be some quick cues to key you into the different blood supplies and innervations.
So here's the question that I often get.
Yeah.
When you're reviewing the information, right? So you're seeing the stories, you're seeing Elvis bending over trying to help out Messi. You have many times, especially during the first review, you might get one or two real triggers, meaning you'll get one or two translations for what that visual represents. But sometimes you're I have absolutely no idea what Elvis was doing or what Elvis represented. Does that ever happen to you guys where you're seeing these images when you're reviewing and you're what did that even why did I picture that person or doing that action? Does that ever happen to you guys?
Sometimes, yeah. And the way I usually handle that is if it's something that I think is not immediately obvious to me why that image is what it is, in my note of that mnemonic. So like Cathy said, we have this way of taking notes. I'll write Elvis, and then I'll write equals pelvic nerve. you know, and so that way, if there's any if I think there might be any confusion about what it represents, I'll have that note there, and I can always go back and see what it was.
Gotcha. Okay. So you guys take extensive notes on all of this. It's not just like you're storing it on the location and then you walk away and that's it. Like you actually go back and you do your note taking on top of like creating these visuals, right?
Yeah, it's like you said earlier, right? It's kind of misleading if you just think about it as like, oh, I put it in there and now I don't ever have to, review it again, right? So that's one of the things is we do take notes on it. That way we can consistently review it in the same way that we encoded it, so that it just, we're not kind of imagining something different every time and then it's all messy. Hey.
Pun intended.
Yeah.
No. Cool. And so, okay, here's another one. Reusing characters or like images that you've already used for other terms. So if you have, is there anything else that you would use messy for, or like, and we'll stick with that example just because we used it twice already. So if you ever see like messy again, will that always represent something that has to do with the gut, or will you use messy like that player for something completely separate and different if you see that term somewhere else?
So we try to keep it consistent so that if we saw messy again, it would be something to do with the mesenteric arteries, and that's actually part of what Alex was talking about in terms of organization, because that does allow us to kind of quickly scan through and say, where have I seen messy before? And then you just start having this sense, right? The sense that we were talking about earlier for when you see that image, what it means, all the things associated with it. It's one thing I say is like, if I asked you to think about all the pizza places in your hometown, you can easily think of, where all the pizza was and everything that kind of is associated with those restaurants. And so when we keep those images consistent, it kind of allows us to do that quick scanning and quick thinking.
Yeah. And so just to add on to that, we try to keep those images consistent for sure. The one thing we might do is we try not to reuse the images. So like if something else comes up that sort of sounds like messy, I will do my best to not make it messy again, just because it can sometimes get confusing if you've got a bunch of messies running around that are doing different things.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that like, if maybe, if let's say the inferior mesenteric vein comes up, mesenteric veins obviously are a little different than the arteries. What I might do just to kind of come up with an image for that easily is use some sort of category. And so maybe I'll imagine like a different Argentinian soccer player for the veins, right? So, it'll be... So, every time I think messy, it'll be just for the mesenteric arteries. And then maybe there's this, maybe it's the Argentine goalkeeper. And I have no idea who that is, but just kind of the general notion that it's that goalkeeper, somebody else will cue me into it being the mesenteric veins instead of the arteries.
Because it does feel related that way.
Right.
Right. Because then at that point, you're seeing a soccer player.
Right.
And you're like, wait, okay, well, there was messy, but that was an artery. Oh, this one must be the vein, right?
Yeah.
And it would trigger that. So that's a good tip right there. It's kind of like similar to when I memorize names, when we memorize names and faces. So for me, like for every owl, like a owl, I picture the bird, an owl, right? And Alex, I'll picture like an owl flexing.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'll like change it up a little bit. And Albert is like an owl, but his body is a burrito. So it's just like the top of the head popping out of the burrito.
Right.
So it's like I'll use something similar, which is an owl, but then I'll like morph it into something else. For you morphed it into like another soccer player, right? So it's still messy in a way, but it's just, a soccer player.
Yeah.
That can trigger that response. Cool. It's good tip there. Cool. So then we have that was Elvis. We did the Elvis one at the end. You gave me some examples of pharmacology. Is that how you say pharmacology?
Yeah.
You just put pharm here.
So just drugs, basically.
Just drugs.
Yeah.
I get a lot of questions about that actually. Like people are always asking, like, how do you memorize drugs and their effects, what they do, the type of dosage, all that kind of stuff. Like, what specific tips and techniques do you guys use to help you remember that information?
Well, you came up with that one, so.
You want to do this one too?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the basic idea obviously is the same as what we've been talking about. And so, to kind of continue on this kind of organizational point, oftentimes when we're doing pharmacology, each like room or area of the palace will be devoted to one type of drug. So let's say I'm doing penicillins. So penicillins is a pretty big category, but let's say I'm using this room right here for some of the broader spectrum penicillins. So those would be like ampicillin and amoxicillin. Okay, so there are these two penicillin drugs, ampicillin and amoxicillin, that have similar, they're used to treat similar things, so that's why I'm grouping them together.
Yeah.
So this room is for those two. And then let's just say, I wanted to remember the way that you take them. So one kind of important thing is that amoxicillin is taken orally, so in your mouth, versus ampicillin, not as much. So that's obviously kind of an unintuitive fact. That's something that it would be helpful, you might be good to use memory techniques for, right? So one easy way we might do that, as a kind of alternative example, is that amoxicillin has an O kind of close to the beginning of it. So amoxicillin versus ampicillin. And you might just imagine that O is a mouth,
an open
right?
mouth.
So this is what Cathy suggested to me. This is how she did it. So that's an easy way that it doesn't even really use images.
The word just visually looks like it's an open mouth.
Right. So that's a quick way to do it. And that's something that we might do. It doesn't necessarily need to be this kind of palace plus image thing. The way I did it, though, was on one of the loci in this room. Let's say, again, pretend this room is those two drugs. I imagine myself on the locus just sort of sitting there eating like shells, like ammo. Right. So I just imagine
ammo shells.
Yeah, ammo shells, gun shells. And I just imagine myself eating those, and that cues me into that ammo, amoxicillin, is the oral drug. So that's a quick example there. Let's say we wanted to learn the side effects of those two drugs. So there's three big ones. Hypersensitivity reactions, which just kind of like an allergic reaction. Obviously a lot of people are allergic to penicillin, so that's a pretty intuitive one. Another one is rash. So it's also kind of a similar thing. And the last one is pseudomembranous colitis, which basically means like in your large intestine, the drug can kind of damage some bacteria, and you'll get this damage to your enterocytes in there, which will cause this membrane to form in your colon, in your large intestine. So hypersensitivity reactions, rash, and pseudomembranous colitis. So I would pick maybe one locus to do those side effects in this room. So let's say that I'm using this computer here. Hypersensitivity reactions, the first thing I thought of was Trump, because he's hypersensitive to everything. So maybe I'm imagining Trump sort of sitting here working on my computer, and maybe imagine he's got his shirt off and there's a big rash on his back. And then for pseudo,
he is a little orangey, so
that's true too. Yeah. And so for the other one, pseudomembranous colitis, it kind of looks like it's just this like kind of mass of this sheath of cells. And so I always use my image is a plastic bag, just because it looks kind of similar. So, and this kind of gets back to a point, which is I don't always, encode it in a way that it sounds. It could just be the way that the thing looks, right? So pseudomembranous colitis kind of looks like this plastic bag. So I imagine a big plastic bag just like pulled over Donald Trump's head. So we've got Donald Trump at his computer. He's got a rash on his back and a bag over his head. So, that's hypersensitivity reactions, rash, and pseudomembranous colitis. So those, that's the basic way that I would encode information for those two drugs. And then if there were other information, the mechanism of the drug, I would just kind of keep moving around the room, choosing loci as I see fit.
Cool. Great examples, great visuals. That's another thing you pointed out right there. It's like it doesn't always have to necessarily always have like a direct translation. Like say the word benevolent. For me, I would picture a bone and an envelope, just because bone, right? Envelope. Mm-hmm. But like you're saying, hypersensitivity, you just picture Trump. That doesn't have a direct relation to the word. But it's like a lot of times when you're looking at these, what I like to do is just ask myself, what does it remind me of, right? So it doesn't always have to be just the bone and the envelope for benevolent. It could be, like you said, something more ambiguous, something more abstract, such as, say, a Trump. And then for you, like what you guys said earlier, if you guys see that and you see Trump there and you're having a tough time like remembering what that was, you'll refer back to your notes at that point, right? Or you'll make some extra notes to tell you, like, hey, whenever I see this Trump, that means hypersensitivity. Is that kind of how
exactly?
The process works,
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Cool. All right. Do we have some more examples?
Let's take a look.
Yeah.
Why don't we do this one so we can show that it doesn't,
okay, that's a good one.
you want.
That's a good one. Okay, so the next one we're going to do is like a biochemistry example.
Biochemistry is like really great for memory techniques, I think.
Because it's very, most of the things don't really make sense, right? It's just like stuff you got to know. And so the example we're going to do is basically the necessary elements, or specifically amino acids, that you need to make purines. So purine is a type of nucleic acid, like in DNA, and you need certain amino acids to be part of those that.
So like the ingredients,
anabolism, right? Yeah, the ingredients, exactly. So there's a list basically of important ones that you need, and as far as we can tell, right, there's no like intuitive way to understand why these specific ones are there. It's just a list that you got to know, and they'll ask you about it. So this is ripe for memory techniques, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you take the first set?
Yeah, so there's 4: aspartate, glycine, glutamine, and THF, which is tetrahydrofolate. And so when I saw these, like you guys have been saying, like I kind of just want to think of the first thing I think of, the thing that I feel like it is, it reminds me of. So aspartate reminded me of asphalt, kind of has a lot of the same letters. So what I did was honestly, I just used an imaginary house. I was kind of walking down this street in our hometown, and I know there's a townhouse. I've obviously never been in this stranger's house, but that's like another thing is, I wasn't running out of palaces, but I could just create a palace in my mind. It doesn't have to be a place I've really been. And so what I did was I went through this house, this fake house that I created in my mind, and I put asphalt in for aspartate. And for glycine, I thought of ice, glycine, icine. Glutamine, I thought of glutes. So like doing a really mean squat to work on your mean glutes, glutamine, and tetrahydrofolate. So that's kind of, we get a lot of folates in biochem when we were memorizing them. And so I've always thought of folate as a foal, like, a baby horse. And so for tetrahydrofolate, like we kind of modified the messy. I just thought of like 4 horses attached to a carriage.
Right.
Tetrahydrofolate. So these are just the ones that immediately popped to my mind. Or in the case of tetrahydrofolate, I was kind of modifying a category, a pre-existing category.
Yeah.
I see. Now, would you picture all of that like in that imaginary house, like all on one spot?
Yeah,
like all linking together?
Yeah, so the way I did it, I like to space my stuff out a little bit more. And so because this is an imaginary house, I could pretty much create it exactly the way I wanted to. So I just imagined this was a townhouse. So on the front door, I imagined a bunch of asphalt just kind of like covering the door so I couldn't get in. And then the front living room is just full of large ice blocks. And then in the bathroom, because this is my fake house that I'm making, right? In the bathroom, it's just someone doing squat glutes, glutamine squats for a mean glute. And then in the kitchen in the back, I just imagined this huge carriage with 4 horses in them. And so, because it was my fake house.
So essentially like one image per locus.
One image per locus, but it was my fake house, right? And then it kind of feels like very connected and melded together.
Yeah, and just to take that on, we thought it could be interesting, to show my images versus Cathy's images and show kind of how they were different. Hopefully that could be helpful to people. So for these same 4, I think all of my images are different for all of them. And so just to start out, the palace that I was using at this time was this place just outside this old building on the Ole Miss campus that we both used to work in. Which happens to be a pharmacy building. And so there are these big long steps. And so I imagined basically a shuffleboard kind of little piece, gliding right down those steps. And then basically there's someone at the top using a glue, using like Elmer's glue to try to like get it to come back up, like to pull it up with this big stream of glue. So those represent, the shuffleboard and its gliding represents the glycine. And then the glue represents glutamine. So that these are obviously different images from Cathy's, and then those are 2 images that I put on that locus, and then I'll move kind of down those steps, and there's this parking lot nearby, and so for there I just imagine Bart Simpson hitting a T-ball. So there's Bart Simpson for aspartate, and then the T-ball kind of reminds me of THF, and I use, unlike Cathy, I use baseball bats for anything to do with folate, and so the T-ball kind of reminds me that it's TH folate, so tetrahydrofolate. So I've got the glue and the gliding shuffleboard, and then aspartate Bart hitting the T-ball THF.
Got it. All right. So it's okay. This is two great methods of viewing it. You can just space it out, put one image or one association per location, or you can combine them and create like a nice little story with 2. Or do you ever put more than 2? Like I'm pretty sure you can possibly like create this one story along that railing or the stairs where you have all four of them, right? Just like linking back to each other. So I mean, it's okay to use both. At the end of the day, I think for people, it's like test it out, right? Test out what method works for you. If you're having a hard time with seeing, like, let's say you store 4 things in one spot in one locus, and you're like, man, I'm just having a hard time recalling, say, the third thing or the second thing, then space it out. Do what Cathy does. She spaces it out and puts 1 on each location. It doesn't have to we don't all have to use the same exact method, but at the end of the day, it's just all about using your creativity to come up with these associations, and then the actual method on how to do it, just play with it on your own and see what works best for you. Because I get a lot of people asking me, so what do you do specifically for this one thing? I'm like, well, this is what so do I have to do it that way? I'm like, test it out. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, change it up. See what works for you, what works best for you. So yeah, everybody has their own little, side methods of doing things.
Exactly.
So that's good. I like the fact that you guys gave me examples. And not only that, but the images were like pretty much completely different.
Yeah, they
right?
were.
The images were different. The locations were different. So it's what you think of when you're looking at that piece of information, and when you're reciting. Now, with that being said, do you guys right now? Do you guys take classes together, like the same type of classes?
Well, we're not in class right now, but when we do, we're all every person in our 140 of us are all in the same class. Yeah.
Yeah. So we are, just to be clear, we finished our second year last year, and we're actually taking a year off from school. So we're not in class right now.
So when you guys were during your second year, when you guys were taking the same classes, did you guys ever like sit down and like actually come up with the same associations for the information that you're learning, or did you guys separately say, okay, I'm gonna focus on this subject and I'm gonna cover it, use my locations and my stories, and then we kind of come together? What was your process there when you guys were taking the same classes?
We mostly worked individually. I think because, as the last example showed, the things that really pop in your mind can vary, right? Alex will have people who do sports and stuff, and I don't, because I just can't, it's just harder for me.
I see.
So we mostly worked individually, but I will say if we got stumped, there was never any hesitation for me to say, what image did you use,
Yeah, so we often, I mean, exactly what she said, we often did this thing where we would, because often the hardest part of doing this is thinking of that image for the association, like for Bart Simpson aspartate or whatever. So what I might do is just be sitting here and be like, I'm having some trouble with, an image for methimazole, let's say, which is just some, a drug. And then Cathy would like, I used a Thin Mint for that. And I was like, okay, yeah, Thin Mint, that's pretty good. The methimazole Thin Mint. So we would often just kind of ask each other images like that.
Got it. Okay. So mainly worked individually, but whenever you guys were stumped, you guys would refer back to each other.
Yeah.
That's cool. Who had the best ideas usually where you guys would ask each other? Who would ask who more? Was it Alex? I'm pretty sure it was Alex.
I asked Cathy a lot. Yeah. I mean, as good as you think I might be at coming up with images, I am often asking Cathy for help. Yeah. For good images. She has good ones, like Thin Mint, methimazole. That's a pretty slick one. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're the go-to, huh?
Well, on that note, like one thing I really struggled with, because, Alex and you guys have been doing this for a long time, and you are trained to do it kind of quickly, like in this element of time, for me, like when I first started, I was really, really specific about how I wanted it to sound, and I wanted it to be kind of perfect. Like, at the beginning, aspartate, right, or glycine. I would never just use ice for glycine. I would be like, that's too far removed. I can't do that. And it would take me a really long time to encode anything because I would just have to make it perfect. But now I'm much more comfortable just saying, this is what I think of. I'm okay with it. I'll review it and I'll get it.
Yeah,
exactly.
The tendency for a lot of people starting out can be like, let's say I'm learning methimazole, right? They might imagine like, okay, meth, him, like, so you've got like some sort of guy doing meth, and then he's using some sort of like, and you imagine like his soul leaving his body or something. It's like for methimazole, like you put all of these things together. And that's not really what we do anymore. That was kind of another thing we started to do was just, we found that, after a couple reviews, like we've been saying, those associations stick pretty well, and you don't really need to kind of have that perfect audio connection, it becomes very quick to associate, let's say, Trump with hypersensitivity reaction, so you don't need to have like a really complicated image just to cue that in. It's just about getting some sort of cue, some sort of simple visual cue.
Yeah.
Quicker. It's the same as when we're like trying to memorize lyrics to songs, right? Or when we hear a song on repeat on the radio, and we might know the full lyrics, but while it's playing, but if I ask you right now, hey, can you start from like the middle section of that Taylor Swift song? I don't know any of her songs.
Yeah.
Let's say, the Taylor Swift song. You'll probably be like, I don't know, I don't know where to start. But if you hear the like one or two words, boom, like that entire chorus section.
That's a perfect example. Same kind of thing.
Cool. So it's all about the review, because that's, radio stations, they're pros at this. They have us forcefully review these songs over and over again in a spaced period of time, right? So it's not like they play the song and then right away they play it, back to back to back, but they play the song and then an hour, 2 hours from now, they'll play the song again. So let me ask you about that. So when you're reviewing, what's your process with reviewing? How often and how often do you space it out when you're like, okay, I have to go back and review all the gut information that I memorized or all the, pharmacology information? How often do you guys review?
Do you want to? It's kind of your thing.
Is it?
I don't know.
Well, okay, so we actually do something very particular for reviewing. And that is that we use a program, like a software called Anki, to basically take all of our notes. So it's essentially like a flashcard program where, you'll write like some sort of question on the front and the answer on the back, right? And the way this program works is it's what's called a spaced repetition program. So it uses an algorithm to basically give the card back to you to review it at certain points in time. So like, and it's called spaced repetition because the time that you review it will space out more and more in time, because theoretically you've gotten to know the information better, right? So if I learn, hypersensitivity, rash, and pseudomembranous colitis for those 2 drugs, maybe Anki will give that card back to me, say on day 2, right, or day 4, and then so I'll do it then, and assuming I got it right, then it'll come back and give it to me again to review, like on day 12 or 15 or something. And then after that, it would be like, 2 months from now. So it kind of spaces it out more and more. And then if it's something that comes back that you've forgotten, it'll kind of kick it back to the beginning. So you'll see it more often. So the idea is that the things that you know well, you don't review very often. The things that you do know or that you don't know, you review more often. So that's how we do our review process. And we kind of let Anki do all the hard work of scheduling the reviewing for us.
Cool. And then is this software on Windows and Mac? Or
it is.
How would somebody get access?
Yeah, it's just a free.
Just Google it.
Just Google Anki. I think the website is ankisrs.net. So ankisrs.net. And yeah, one of the really, I've sort of become like a kind of amateur Anki salesman, because I talk about it a lot. We use it a lot. But basically, it's free for computers, Mac PC, but you can also get an app on your phone. Unfortunately, for iPhone, it's like $25, which is steep for an app. But we use it so much that it was kind of an easy, it's well worth it. Yeah. So to be able to do it on a computer, see it on any device that you've got, it's great to be able to just carry your notes with you wherever you go.
Yeah, and the other thing is, because it's in this flashcard format, it does force you to be more active learner. You see the question, you don't just we don't just click to see the answer. You kind of slows you down, makes you think about it. Which
that's
is
an
just
important part of the process too. We don't just reread notes, right? You're kind of always quizzing yourself rather than just rereading things kind of passively.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great. I use Quizlet. Have you guys ever tried using?
Yeah,
Quizlet?
it's similar.
Yeah, I have not used Quizlet personally, but I assume it's the same thing. Yeah, from what I've seen.
It doesn't automatically tell you like when to review information again, but it does have like a star option. So what I do is like if I'm having a tough time with one particular card, I'll just star it myself. So I have to like manually put a star,
right?
And then after I'm done with a set, so let's say half of them I was kind of uneasy about, I can just press the stars, and then all the ones that I starred, boom, pop up, and all the ones that I've already I'm more familiar with, go off to the side.
Right.
So okay, it's very similar.
I mean, it's like
Yeah.
when, I used to make index cards all the time for school, right? But now it's better. It's just like all on my phone, and I never lose it. And
exactly. And you're saving trees, right?
Exactly. That's the most important
You're
part.
not cutting. Right. Cool. Now, listen, I could keep talking to you guys for hours about this, and I know many students out there have also a lot of questions. And you have some more examples here, but actually, I probably won't get into those right now unless you guys really want to.
That's okay.
But to wrap, I think the examples that we gave that was really good, strong examples on how to really apply this to school to their studies. And just wrapping up, what are some like major tips outside of the memory techniques are powerful, they're great, right? When once you use them, they're very helpful. But that's not all that it takes for you to become a successful student, or successful in anything in particular. But specifically right now for school, you need other things such as the right mindset, such as having other motivational factors to really push you through school, because there's going to be ups and downs, and it's not always just about studying. It's about other factors that come into play when you're in school. So what are some tips that you would give to right now, say even first-year college students that maybe just finished their first semester or going into their first semester? What would you give? What advice would you give to those types of students to kind of help them out throughout the college and university experience?
My big one, and I always say this, is use the Pomodoro technique. And you've probably heard of this, Lewis. Oh, okay. So we're both big on this.
Yeah.
We're both big on this.
I'm pretty sure I taught her how to do this, just to clear the air.
Okay. All right.
Side note.
That's the most.
I invented this.
I didn't invent it, but I brought it to her attention.
He brought it into this family, and now it's a big deal in our family. So the basic idea is that you want to work for a concentrated period of time, but then allow yourself a dedicated break so that your mind can rest, your eyes can rest. And so what we do is 25 minutes on. And during that time, you don't check your email, you don't look at your phone, you don't fidget with your music, you don't do anything. And it's short enough that you can tell yourself, my gosh, I can do anything for 25 minutes. I can have self-discipline for 25 minutes. And then you take 5 minutes off and you rest, you get up, drink water, go to the bathroom. And then you do that. And then every 4 cycles, you can have a 15-minute break. And since starting it, and you can, it's probably the same for you, you really realize how much time 25 minutes is and how much you can really get done if I'm not looking at my phone, checking Facebook.
Yeah, another thing I'll do is I like to just keep track of the number that I've done, number of Pomodoros that I've done. So every time I finish one, I'll go over to our fridge and I have this little paper where I'll just put a little tally mark. And that way I can keep track, at the end of the day, if I've done 16 Pomodoros, that was a good day, and I can kind of motivate myself that way to get enough done, so that if I do, maybe only 7, I'm like, okay, well, didn't get that much done today, and sort of motivate myself that way. Yeah. Another nice thing I like about it is, it can be a little daunting. If you just say, okay, I'm going to spend today studying for 10 hours, like she said, there's obviously no way you can just study 10 hours straight and be a sane person afterwards. So it's nice to have these little breaks in there built in. You can last 25 minutes and then just take that break. And then during that break, you can also, I like to just get out a book and read or watch a YouTube video or something. And that way, I have these kind of set periods of time where I can give myself some sort of reward. And, by the end of 10 hours, even if I'm studying for 10 hours, I felt like I got this sort of, little dopamine hits throughout that time to keep me going, to feel like by the end of that time, I wasn't just boring myself out of my mind or anything like that. So yeah, we like that method.
Yeah.
And then I guess, if I'll say something else, a thing that I like to do in terms of productivity or whatever, I think one good thing is for students is to try to come up, get a pretty consistent daily routine. And so a big part of that, for instance, would be waking up at the same time every day. So if you kind of do that and you wake up at the same time every day, and that you kind of are supposed to finish breakfast by point X and this thing by point Y, then you can get into a routine that cuts down on the amount of kind of wasted transition time that you have throughout the day. And I think that tends to make people more productive.
So this is what I mean about him being really disciplined, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So gotta stick to that schedule, because even let's say we're using the Pomodoro method and you're taking the breaks, you schedule 5 minutes, and sometimes you're just like, well, another 5 minutes. Oh wait, another 10 minutes. Another, whatever. You want to, you're off track now, and then you're, a few hours deep into your break that should have spent, taken 5 minutes. So, like you said, set a schedule and force yourself to, keep that schedule. And it does become easier the more that you do it. It becomes a habit after a while, right? Where you do it several times, and at first you're gonna have to force yourself to go through it, but then afterwards it's just like, all right, I guess it's a habit now. It's like brushing your teeth at that point, right?
Yeah.
It's more of a unconscious activity.
Yeah.
Cool. So now, when it comes down to preparing for, say, an actual exam, right, finals, midterms, whatnot, did you change up strategies, or was it something else that you added to your actual study habits when you were getting ready to do something like that, like doing your midterms or exams or final exams?
I think one thing that we like to do is to incorporate questions into our routine.
Practice tests,
even getting with a friend and just quizzing each other, because that forces you out of the memory palace and into this kind of problem-solving mode. So I think that's pretty easy to understand.
I mean, the way Anki works is that, when you wake up every day, Anki will have like a set of cards saying you're supposed to review these cards today. So ideally what we try to do, every day is in the morning we get those review cards done. And that's pretty much consistent throughout our schedule. So whether or not we're taking an exam, whether or not we're on a break, whatever. And then on top of that, like Cathy said, we like to do a lot of practice questions, because that's obviously a hugely important step that is slightly different from just kind of the brute recall of Anki, that gets you kind of thinking a little bit more abstractly, and
if
it's all very important, obviously.
If you're talking with somebody else, you kind of learn from the other person, right? So that's really helpful.
That's good. So practice with other people, and quiz each other. Quizzing yourself ahead of or before those exams. Come in handy. All right, cool. So I mean, again, I can keep asking you these questions. I appreciate you guys' time. Just to wrap up here, how can people find out about what you guys do as far as your services, coaching other people, because you work a lot with other individuals. You were just in Washington. You were at John Hopkins doing a presentation, right? You were teaching other people how to take these techniques and apply it to their life. So how can people reach you if they want to learn more about what you guys do and what you guys offer? Yeah, so our main, presence is mullenmemory.com. So just our last name, MULLEN memory.com. And if you go on there, there's all kinds of, our sort of tagline is, free resources exploring memory techniques as learning tools. So, everything on there is free. There's videos, there's tips, and you can just kind of look around there and see what we've got. We haven't put like a ton of stuff on, quite as much information as we want to put on there, but there's still a lot of good stuff that I think people will enjoy and find useful. And we've also got a couple of different, social media things, Facebook page, Twitter. If you want to just follow those or subscribe with your email through the website
we'll put new information out
to keep up with what's, new things that we post and whatnot. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, hope to see. I mean, I love your guys' videos. They're very informative, very educational. So keep making them.
Thank
keep posting
you, Lewis.
them. I'm subscribed, so make sure everybody else, you guys are subscribed to their channels and everything else that they have going on. So I'll post all the links to that down below or somewhere here, so you guys can check that out. Make sure to follow them. And in closing, what are just some of the goals that you guys want in the next year or two for yourselves in any field, really, career-wise or education-wise? What are your goals in the next 1 to 2 years?
Well, we hope to graduate. That's the big one. So, in June we're gonna, and I hope we both, well, for me at least, but my goal for both of us is I hope that we're able to find a career that's meaningful for us and pick the specialty that's a good match for us and will allow us to be excited and happy about what we do.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we're kind of excited about a lot of this memory technique stuff that we do, and that's, hopefully going to be a big part of our future, but also, the big thing really for me, and like Cathy just said, for the next four to 5 years or so is kind of getting into the hospital more, which is something we haven't really done, and figuring out what specific things we like and what specialty we want to do, and so that's obviously going to be a big part of the future.
We love memory, right? But medicine is also a big interest of ours.
That's your passion,
right?
Yeah. And there are some pretty interesting ways that medicine and memory can overlap, which hopefully we can start to explore a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's awesome. I love it. All right. Thank you. How long was this? This is like a few hours, over an hour. Cool. I appreciate you guys' time. Remember, you guys can always check them out. Links down below, mullenmemory.com. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next interview. Peace out. We out.